have requested that I record this thing. So anyway, so let's get started. Community housing in Maine. I think it's the missing piece here that we often hear about. Let's just start with where we're at. So we all know that we're in a pretty desperate situation, I think, anyway, in the state of Maine. The BDN put out this article a few months ago showing how it's getting harder and harder to be a renter in the state. I can second that from my own experience as being a renter for a long time in the state of Maine. And it's just not getting easier. We have an 80,000 unit deficit, and we're only building, between 1,000 and 2,000 units a year. And so that's leading to a crisis in homelessness. And we've seen this, rise of encampments. That's been a huge issue of late. And lastly, on top of all that, this article just came out today. More and more people are moving to Maine ever since the pandemic. We've seen a huge increase in population, which is great in a lot of ways, but it's also really hard because we simply don't have the housing. Maine still is among the oldest housing stock in the country, and it's not getting any easier. So we need more options, more tools at our disposal. And that's where I think this idea of community housing comes in. So where it's being done, we'll hear a lot from different people tonight about the Montgomery County, the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County, Maryland. They came and gave a presentation to the legislature, to the Select Housing Committee back in March. I'll be sharing that video with everybody in the email invite. People should have seen a link for that. So taking a lot of inspiration from them doing this mixed income, publicly owned model that works really well in a public housing authority. And we'll talk about that. So Seattle just passed by referendum a developer that will do this model of housing. Senator Stanley Chang sponsored a bill that's becoming a pilot project. So that's really exciting. And we'll hear from him shortly. And believe it or not, we actually do have some housing in Maine that follows a very similar development model. So University of Southern Maine just built this brand new Portland Commons building here in Portland. And if people haven't seen it, they should check it out. It's beautiful. It's was funded with a $70 million bond by the university system. And rents there average between $500 and $1,500 a month, which for Portland is pretty good. And, it's for students all across different colleges and universities in Southern Maine. So that's, if we can do it for students, I think we can do it for everybody. So where does community housing fit in our current system of affordable housing? One of the reasons I wanted to put this presentation together is because I feel really strongly that there's just not a lot of understanding about how all our, we have a lot of different conflicting ways of creating affordable housing. Some work, some don't, they sometimes conflict. And, but everybody agrees that we're just not getting the type and the amount of housing built that we need to get built. So that's where this comes in. Right now, there's really nothing to help middle income earners. So people earning between 80% and 120% of HUD area median income. In Portland, you might be thinking, that's between so $50,000 and $80,000, somewhere in that, somebody making that income bracket. These are our teachers, these are our firefighters, our EMTs, our people working in, they're providing really needed services for our communities, and they're working hard, but they're having a hard time affording to live in the communities where they live, affording to live in the communities where they work. So that's a big problem. And there really aren't that many programs to help middle income earners. But community housing helps all income earners because it's mixed income. And the idea is that because it is mixed income, is that it's cross-subsidized, so it creates affordable units for lower income brackets as well. And it's not reliant and does not compete, very importantly, with other methods of creating affordable housing. So like, there's a lot of really great mission-driven nonprofits out there that do incredible work, and they're doing great work, and we want to support them in that, but we also need we need to use every tool at our disposal in a crisis of this magnitude. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current methods of creating affordable housing, like the big ones. Each one of these topics could really be an hour and a half presentation on its own, but I'll just go over them, really quickly. Leave it to the market. That's, kind of a lot, historically has never really gotten us to a place of creating decent, safe, and sanitary housing for most people. We had slums in this country for a long time until the 1930s, and then that's sort of where public housing came in. So we'll talk a little bit about federal HUD public housing, the low-income housing tax credit development program. That's kind of like the big method of creating housing now these days. And then the Section 8 housing choice voucher. All these things work together. So the big one that we work with today, and again, this is going to be a lot of information, so I'm recording this. We'll have a chance for Q&A at the end. The low-income housing tax credit is a mechanism that allows for companies and individuals to provide low-interest loans to housing developers in exchange for tax breaks. And they build housing that's affordable to certain income brackets, mainly to people making 60% of area median income. And it, tend to be like people with a Section 8 voucher, which I'll get into next. Since 1986, this has been the primary means of creating affordable housing in the country. And units are deed restricted to remain affordable for 15, 30, and 45 years, depending on the type of build. And so what's been happening in recent years is that a lot of these low-income, the LIHTC developments have come out of their affordability deed restrictions, and some have gone into market rate. So that's one thing to note. Moving on, the section choice voucher, or the housing choice voucher, Section 8. It's also administered by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It pays 70% of a low-income tenant's rent to participating landlords. It allows flexibility where a tenant can live. Problem with it is that a lot of landlords simply don't want to accept the Section 8 voucher, and there's often discrimination. We have bills in the Housing Committee about that. It's an unfortunate situation. And there are long wait lists with this program because there's just, not a lot of money out there coming from the federal government to do it. So, the wait list can be several months to several years. You hear people, waiting years and years and years on these vouchers. So one good thing about community housing is that it would work really well with voucher holders. It would create housing that would work for them. And then what is public housing? At least the Section 9 HUD public housing, that a lot of people maybe have an idea in their head of what public housing is. This is the New Deal era housing program that was enacted in 1937. And actually, I was doing some research about this. And interestingly, in 1938, there was a lot of criticism of the program because right off the bat, they were creating sort of mixed income, high quality housing. And they were a little bit of a victim of their own success, the Public Works Administration. So it became this whole, there was a big critique that they created better quality housing for cheaper than the market could do. And that was a real problem at the time. So anyway, then it quickly became a program that could only serve the lowest income brackets, typically people making 30 to 50% AMI. It's managed by the local public housing authorities, which we have a whole bunch in Maine. A number of them are on the call tonight. They do incredible work with dwindling federal resources, but it's, and a lot of the public housing authorities these days also do like LIHTC development, number of other programs that they administer. So they do excellent work and we want to support them. But again, this program was sort of systematically underfunded. And then nowadays, most public housing has actually gone into nonprofit, private ownership. through what's called a RAD conversion. So most public housing nowadays is really public. Other tools that we should, just touch on in Maine, we have the Home Fund, which is administered by Maine Housing, funded through the real estate transfer tax. They can use that money to help create extra financing for LIHTC deals and things like that. We have the Rural Affordable Rental Rental Housing Program. That's also Maine Housing. So the 70 million that the legislature enacted in last year, the last term in the supplemental budget, most of that money went to LIHTC and the Rural Rental Housing Program. And then, of course, we passed LD2, and I'm not sure if Madam Speaker is on the call or not, but that's a great program using the other half of real estate transfer tax to create housing first. So those are some other tools that are out there. And just to end this, my portion of the talking here, because I know people want to hear from everybody else. You hear from me all the time, so I want to hear from people too. So. But just to close this out, what really is, what could community housing look like? It's mixed income, it's permanently affordable, it's tenant controlled, publicly or cooperatively owned. We'll hear about some other models where those, could create private equity as well for, tenants, and, we could have private ownership eventually. Livable community amenities, high quality, climate resilient construction. Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County is building to passive house standards, like really huge buildings. So as this sort of crisis accelerates and intersects with housing, this is one way to address it. A revenue neutral solution. This is not going to need a lot of taxpayer investment over time because it does pay itself off. And we'll hear more about that from other speakers. It's a supply side solution. It's going to create more housing for everybody, allowing for reduced rents without necessarily having to put more and more, restrictions and regulations on the private market. And it's whoops, I just lost it. So it's I think this is the future. So we're not reinventing the wheel, because this has been done before. And it's been done in different places of the country, and I feel like it's time that we bring it back here. So that is my portion. I will also be sending out some resources to folks about just like, if you want more homework, if you're a big wonk and a nerd like me, then you might want to read some of this. And I will be sending all this out to everybody after the call. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And I am thrilled now to welcome Senator Stanley Chang all the way from Hawaii. So please, Senator, excited for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Representative Lookner, for the honor of addressing everyone here tonight. It's been a pleasure researching some of the successful models abroad, like in Vienna and Singapore, with you. And I really admire the commitment of the legislature, or at least the interest of the legislature in researching this model. I'm shocked and very pleasantly surprised that so many of you would participate in this type of a forum. And I wish I would have the chance to address our own legislature here in Hawaii with so much interest. So let me see if I can share my presentation here. I saw that someone in the chat is actually in Hawaii right now, and I wanted to start with this picture of a beach in my district to make everyone a little bit jealous of where you could be. And because Representative Lookner also mentioned that we should emphasize that one thing that Hawaii and Maine have in common is our tourism industry. So I'm calling this concept social housing here, that's something I actually got from our friends in Vienna, and I know that's been adopted in California as well. Community housing. This is actually the first time I've heard the term community housing, but I think it's a great term because there are a lot of downsides with the existing terms that we have, like public housing, like government housing, like social housing, all of which come with their own negative connotations. Community housing might be the best term I've heard yet to describe this unique set of features. And oh, sorry about that. Not sure what just happened. Let me try to go back. This unique set of features, Representative Lookner just went through a long list of the vision. And here I'm just going to try to focus on 3 of them. I think revenue neutrality is really important because it's the single biggest difference between this model of housing and our existing models of housing, which all rely on heavy subsidies. I think income blindness is an aspirational target. Singapore, Vienna, a lot of these other jurisdictions don't have truly income blind housing. They just have very high limits, or they apply the limits only on day one. But I think that a mature system, a fully realized system, should be fully income blind, just as our public school system is income blind. Public highways, public libraries, public parks, public services should be for the public. And then finally, I think a fully mature system should be universal or non-rationed. We shouldn't have the system that we have now, like with Section 8, where only some lucky lottery winners get it. It should be for everyone. Again, like public housing, like public schools. I wanted to focus my presentation, since we don't have that much time, on several of the actual real world examples of this model of housing here in Hawaii, to show that there's actually many ways to skin a cat, most of which have nothing to do with me. And I'll start with this project in Kauai County, the most rural of Hawaii's counties. It's called Limaola. As you can probably see through this rendering, it's a multi-phase project. There's some multifamily, there's some LIHTC financed portions, there's some transitional housing for the homeless. But in the center of the project, you see a bunch of single-family homes. And those single-family homes are community housing. They are designed, they're for people who are making 120% AMI or less, and they're paying for themselves. The infrastructure is subsidized. A lot of the other phases of this project are subsidized, but at least for those single-family homes in the center of this rendering, the sales prices will pay for the construction. And so this is maybe the most fully realized or the most complete model of the social housing that exists in Hawaii today. It's not for a niche population, it's for the general public that's under 120 AMI. And it was really initiated by the county because they were frustrated with the existing models of subsidizing housing, and very aware that with programs like LIHTC, the capital gains in the building actually go to the developer and not to the government. And so this was one of the ways that they focused on to try to ensure that any capital gains would be captured by the county. And so for the resales of these units, these are leasehold units, which means that for the duration of the lease term of 99 years, you can exclude others from the unit, you can mortgage the unit, you can devise it to your heirs, you can sell it. But after 99 years, in principle, you get kicked out and you're left with nothing. And so their resales are actually going to be equity shared with the government. So if you resell your unit within the 99-year time horizon, the government will receive a significant percentage of the upside. And therefore, these won't be attractive targets for speculation and won't make you rich. I'll move on to the University of Hawaii's RISE dorm. I was interested to see in Representative Lookner's presentation that the University of South Maine did one of these too. So I guess this is a nationwide trend. Basically, what happened here was that the developer sold a bond. And so the developer sold the bond, repaid themselves through the proceeds of the bond sale, gave the building to the University of Hawaii Foundation. And the University of Hawaii Foundation is now repaying the debt service from the bond through collecting the rents of these tenants. I don't know exactly how much rent they're paying, but the building exists today. It's fully leased up as of, I think, August of this year. So this is not some pie in the sky proposal. This actually exists today. Here's a diagram. It's a little bit complicated, summarizing the moving parts that I just described. But we don't need to get into it in too much detail. The RISE project was so successful that UH is embarking on another one. It's the redevelopment of a former NOAA site. It's again going to be a dorm for graduate students and junior faculty members. And again, it has a pretty similar concept where they've hired a different developer to build the building, to pay themselves back through the proceeds of a bond sale, and then the rents that are being paid by the tenants will repay the bond, the debt service. So again, what's really interesting is that both of these projects are entirely revenue neutral, and they stemmed out of a desire to be revenue neutral because the University of Hawaii has had a tough time in the legislature. The higher education chair has been really opposed to additional funding for the University of Hawaii. So they were forced to look at this creative solution of unsubsidized housing. And I also want to emphasize that this is also income-blind housing, as I believe that the University of South Maine project probably will be. I've never heard of a dorm that is income restricted. And so this may be a real full realization of the income-blind concept, although it's for a targeted population of university affiliates. So this is a bill that we worked on for many years. This is Act 97 from 2023, earlier this year. This is a bill that we called Aloha Homes, for affordable, locally owned homes for all. A bill that seeks to end the housing shortage in Hawaii through the construction of large-scale 99-year leasehold housing that is revenue neutral, that is income blind, by building high-density development on state-owned lands. And you can see some of the provisions in the bill summarized here. The agency that we gave it to has been in charge of developing a warehouse industrial district, redeveloping it with residential and mixed use, called Kaka'ako, and they've identified a site for it already, or a potential site. But I wanted to emphasize before we leave this slide that it's not fully necessarily revenue neutral, because the legislature did appropriate $1.5 million to adopt the rules and to do community engagement and some site work as well, along with 2 FTE positions. So I consider the seed money, this is really a small amount of money compared to the cost of actually building one of these units. But I think that legislatively, as a legislator, one of the reasons for the bill's success was that we did insert some funds to incentivize the agency to act. And so here is a potential site. This is already owned by the agency. It's, as you can see, an industrial warehouse. This one also does retail for a rice retailer. And in the background, you see some of the high density housing that is currently being built throughout this industrial district. Another agency is also now empowered to do housing. So this is the Hawaii Housing Finance and Development Corporation. This is our housing finance agency that is in charge of doling out LIHTC money and the State Rental Housing Revolving Fund, which is used to leverage LIHTC. This is also a housing development corporation, or really the housing development corporation. And so we've been working on getting HHFDC to really own this project, to really undertake this project, but met a lot of resistance for a number of years. And I think one of the things that I learned as a legislature was it's really hard to force an agency to do something that it doesn't want to do. The bill that we passed is really a very minimal, a very skinny bill. And all it does is it exempts lands that are set aside to it by the governor from the public lands requirement. And the reason why public lands is important is because public lands have a maximum leasehold term of 65 years. And of course, we're aspiring to do a 99-year leasehold project. So what this bill did was it simply removed the only statutory obstacle to HHFDC developing mixed income revenue neutral housing. And that is, we now gave them all the tools in the toolbox they need to do it. They still haven't actually done it. There's discussion now about doing a project in conjunction with the University of Hawaii at a different campus. But I would say that even though we've been working with them for the longest, and even though this bill was passed over a year ago, they haven't necessarily had the vision internally to undertake a project, a pilot project, or any type of project. And it's been a challenge with many obstacles for us to get them to buy into actually doing this. And even, offering to work with them to identify funding sources and to appropriate funding has been a challenge. So we'll move now to our fourth state agency. This is the Hawaii Public Housing Authority, the PHA, that is in charge of administering the Section 9 public housing in Hawaii, along with some Section 8 vouchers. And this is a photograph of our governor, Josh Green, at the signing of the 10,000 unit RFQ that HPHA recently put out. It was won by a California-based developer called High Ridge Costa, and that's the CEO of High Ridge Costa that you see standing next to the governor. I don't think that any public housing authority in the country has developed this many units in years, if not decades. So I would say this is a really path-breaking, historic RFQ. It really represents HPHA's commitment to moving the needle, to developing enough housing to actually move the needle, not just a Band-Aid here and there, a couple hundred units here and there, but really quite a lot of housing that would move housing prices in Hawaii if it were fully executed. And the reason they were able to do this RFQ is because of a bill that we also passed in 2022, Act 251. It unleashes HPHA by doing something slightly different. So before Act 251, HPHA, as you can see in the statutory text, had the ability to plan, develop, construct, and finance public housing projects. It also had the ability to develop with an eligible developer the development of public housing projects. What the bill did was it deleted the word public. So it took the HPHA powers out of the realm of just doing exclusively public Section 9 HUD regulated federal public housing and gave them the ability to do what you see defined here underlined, which is any home, house, residence, building, apartment, living quarter, abode, domicile, or dwelling unit that is designed principally for the purposes of sheltering people. So this now allows HPHA to do unsubsidized housing. It allows them to do housing that's not for rent. It allows them to do housing that is not income restricted by Section 9 regulations. And so this unleashed their ability to do this type of housing. So with this power, they identified a number of sites, and they, really, I think, embraced this goal voluntarily. They, this is a short summary of the 10,000 unit RFQ that was signed, as I mentioned earlier, and they identified a number of their existing sites. This is one of them, the Mayor Wright Home site. It's on a parcel that's very conveniently located right in the heart of urban Honolulu, and it's one of several sites across the 4 counties of Hawaii. There are several other sites that have been identified in the main urban island, which is Oahu, as you can see, but it also includes at least one site on each of the other 3 more rural counties of Hawaii. And then finally, this is a breakdown of what the developer has been able to come up with so far. I think initially the vision was to put the 1,000 for sale community housing units at the Mayor Wright site, the one that was located in urban Honolulu. It looks like the developer is a little bit changing the vision and wanting to distribute a quarter of those units into each of 4 sites, each in the urban area, although the 3 others that are not Mayor Wright are not quite as conveniently located and not quite in the heart of urban Honolulu. As you can see here, though, for the other, 9,000 plus units, the developer does plan to rely on primarily on LIHTC. So they are relying on these federal subsidies that would lock the units into the LIHTC, world and system of regulation. Now, what I would say is while I am not a huge fan of the LIHTC program in general, because it is a private developer focused program that hands over the keys to the developer is paid twice. They not only get paid a development fee, even if the building never gets built, but they also own the building after it is completed and are free to raise the rents to market, as Representative Lookner already identified, after the expiration of the affordability period. In this case, the owner would be the Public Housing Authority, which has no incentive to raise rents to market. And therefore, I think this is a much better use of LIHTC funds than for private developer owned housing. And this is, I think, really under a lot of discussion right now. This is, I think, a first draft, a first crack at it. Like I said, there's some things that I would change, but I really applaud HPHA's willingness to step into the fray and to deliver a number of units that would actually move the needle. So with that, I wanted to leave it there and to be happy to answer any questions at the end too. So thank you again, Representative Lookner, and to all of you for your kind attention.
Thanks, Senator Chang. That was great. Really appreciate you making the time to come talk to us in Maine. Opposite sides of the country, but very similar issues in a lot of ways. So next up, and again, I do want to mention to folks that we'll get to questions and answers at the end. We'll have a chance for people to get into the panelist side of things and talk a little bit. So next up, I am very excited to welcome Assembly Member Alex Lee's Chief of Staff from California, Allison Lim. Unfortunately, Assembly Member Lee is ill this evening, but we do have the next best thing. So excited to hear from Allison. Take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to talk more about what we're doing here in California. Just going to go ahead and share my screen first. All right, so I want to introduce a little bit more about California, just because I know Representative Lookner talked a little bit about it, but here in California, we are a full-time state legislature. So that means that the members are all here on a full-time basis. We do have full-time staff, so our office is 10 staff. Each assembly member represents 500,000 constituents, and we have 80. And so it's a big legislature. This is our job. And so we're really excited to talk about social housing because this has been my boss's priority since he was elected into office in 2020. So my boss is Assemblymember Alex Lee. He was super excited to be here, but unfortunately got food poisoning, so he cannot be here today. But he is the chair on the Select Committee on Social Housing. He is also now the new chair on Human Services. So we are excited to continue our work into next year. And if you have any questions, my contact information is on the slide as well. So social housing, this is the Pinnacle at Duxton in Singapore, just to give you some imagery about what we're talking about. And I know Representative Lookner and Senator Chang talked a lot about social housing, so I'll do my best to not go over the points that they've already done. But I do want to emphasize that when we talk about social housing, for us, at least in our office, we see social housing as a fundamental for how we provide housing as a human right. And this is something that Senator Chang said, so I won't belabor this point, but we do see social housing as housing for everyone. And similar to how we treat roads and schools as a public good, there is no mean testing related to schools and roads. You don't have certain income thresholds. We believe that housing should be treated the same way. Now, 5 ingredients of social housing. This is key to how we have thought of social housing in terms of the legislation we put forward. And we've done 3 iterations of our social housing bill. So I'll focus on one today, but it has been an evolution of process as we've continued these conversations with our stakeholders and legislators. So key components as we're thinking of social housing legislation are financing, public developer expertise, resident input, land banking, and philosophy, because overall we can't have a successful social housing program if we don't have a government that believes that we are ultimately responsible for ensuring that people are able to have homes. And there's social housing around the United States. I'm going to focus my conversation on California, but we're not the only state that's doing this, as you know, from the other presenters here. And so there are a lot of great examples out there. I will focus my points on the Capital Area Development Authority in Sacramento and the work we've done in the state legislature, but there is a big push nationally for this. So I'm really excited to share more with other Maine representatives in other states, because as we continue to work on this and push the conversation forward, we can do really great work on this area. So here's some pictures, and the reason why I wanted to include this is so that people can reconceive what social housing is, because I think that if you were just to say the words public housing, a lot of people may have negative imagery pop into their mind of dilapidated buildings, and that's just not what we've seen when we've studied this in Vienna and Singapore, and it's not what we're seeing now in Montgomery County and in Sacramento. All right, so let's go into social housing in California. So I want to talk a little bit about what our state has done and what we have currently and what we are working towards in the future. So right now, under the governor's executive order, we do have something called the Access Sites Program. So this is an order that orders the Department of General Services and our Department of Housing and Community Development to identify and prioritize excess state-owned property to pursue sustainable, cost-effective projects. So far, DGS has awarded 19 projects through the Access Sites Program. This program started in 2019, so it's only about 4 years old at this time. And we do have one project that has been completed and has people living in it, which I'll get into a little bit later. So our bill this year, AB 309, was the Social Housing Act. So again, I mentioned that we had two previous versions of this bill, but I want to talk about this year's bill because it did get to the governor's desk. And so this year's bill built upon last year's bill, and it also built upon the Access Sites Program. So what we wanted to do was codify this program into statute and allow for the creation of 3 demonstration projects, so 3 social housing projects that would be built on state excess land. And one of the challenges when it comes to social housing is the land, because there is not a lot of examples of housing, like public housing, being built on private land, especially in California. So that's why we focus on state excess land, because the state already owns this land and they are able to extend ground leases at no cost to the developer. So we put some parameters into this where we say that the projects have to demonstrate a commitment to revenue neutrality or cost rent. So when we say revenue neutrality, we mean that the costs of maintaining the units, all of those costs are balance. So the rents that are coming in mean that the project does not go into the red. And then when we say cost rent, we mean that those units are rented at cost. And we have seen this model in places like Lower Austria, where they only charge rent in accordance to how much it costs them to maintain that unit. So these are 2 important principles for us in order to maintain affordable housing. And then ultimately, we also want to ensure that DGS operates as a land bank and extends a ground lease, but the land is publicly owned in perpetuity. And this is really, really important because land is the most expensive resource when it comes to housing in California. So we want to ensure that the government maintains ownership over this land. So I'll talk a little bit more about CADA, which is the Sacramento Capital Area Development Authority. So I'm not a CADA expert, but I want to talk about CADA because it is doing what we strive to do. It is a public agency that fosters and maintains housing, and they function a lot like a private property management and development company, and they are revenue positive. And the reason they're able to be revenue positive, even though they have a portfolio of affordable housing, is because they have office rents. and they also have moderate income units, and they also have some retail space. So across their portfolio, they are able to remain revenue positive because this revenue coming in from the office rents, from the moderate income units, will offset the cost of their affordable units. And so out of their portfolio, a quarter of them are affordable to low income, and they also maintain new private developments of 932 units. Okay, so we'll talk about Sonrisa, which was a project from CADA and an excess sites project. And this project, it was finished this year, so it's fully lived in. Every single unit is lived in. There is a long wait list, but this project is really fascinating because the DGS exercise program started in 2019 and we're in 2023. So in 4 years, we already have a project that has been completed and has people living in it, and that offers 57 100% affordable units. And I don't know what the cost of housing is in Maine, but to provide an example, the rents here in Sonrisa are $635 to $952. Now, in comparison, I did have a 1-bedroom apartment in this area and I paid $2,300. So it is more than half or less than half the cost of market rate rent in this area. And they're able to do this because they have multiple layers of public financing. So the first is that they did not have to pay any costs for the land. The land was extended to them at $0. So that is already a huge chunk of the development costs. In addition to this, they have their own nonprofit arm that is able to do development and financing. So they have their own structure of getting loans. They also have tax credits and bonds that Representative Lookner had talked about. And then they also get some funding from the Department of Housing. And so with the Department of Housing funding, there are certain requirements, such as the retail space on the first floor have to meet certain parameters. But because of this funding, they were able to be successful in 100% affordability. So finally, I want to leave with just illustrating the housing crisis in California, because I don't think it's lost on anyone how expensive housing in California is and how much we lack in affordable housing. And this is why we really make the case for social housing. Social housing is not a replacement of affordable housing. It is meant to complement the existing structures of housing we have. It's also not a replacement of private housing. It is a complement to what we have and a way to address the gaps in housing that we have. Because what we can see is that we have to build 310,000 units per year to meet our goals, our housing goals by 2030. And the current model of affordable housing, it is not addressing this gap in need because it constantly requires additional government funding. There is a constant danger of converting to market rate after the affordability runs out. And it's just insufficient in terms of the amount of housing being built. So we come to social housing as a solution to this because in our model of social housing, it should be self-sustaining after initial funding. And the land is permanently owned by the public, which means that the state will always have the resource of the land in its control. So that is ultimately why we have landed on social housing as being a solution and a complement to our existing housing models. Okay, so just to sum everything up, social housing avoids concentrated poverty by serving a mix of income. Profits are reinvested into the community, and people from all walks of life are able to live together. So that's the end of my presentation. My contact information is here. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and I'm always happy to discuss this further.
That was brilliant, Allison. Thank you. I know my own aide is on the call here, so no shade towards her. But if you ever want a job in the Maine State Legislature, you might take a little bit of a pay cut, but I think we do have cheaper rent than Sacramento. But Assemblymember Lee is lucky to have you. So thank you for that presentation. And nextly, I am super excited to hear from Camille Gix from the Seattle Proposition 135 that passed last year. I do want to note that, everybody speaking here tonight is from the West Coast. I did, Montgomery County, Maryland has been mentioned a few times. They came and presented to the Housing Committee last spring. And I'm going to share that video tonight or later with everybody. They weren't able to join us tonight, but there's also been pilots in or not studies in different states like Rhode Island. So this is not just a West Coast phenomenon. I just happen to know all these folks from working with them and traveling. So Camille, excited to hear from you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I am looking forward to questions. But as Representative Luckner said, I'm Camille. I was a policy advisor for the Initiative 135 campaign in Seattle that created the Seattle Social Housing Developer back in February. I am also a policy analyst and did my graduate thesis on Montgomery County's financing mechanism. So I'll be talking a little bit more in detail about how that works and how Seattle wrote our policy to model after Montgomery County. So I'm going to share my screen now. So I'm just going to do a very brief presentation as well, with the goal of mostly answering questions that people might have on our initiative and the Montgomery County financing model and how that is applying to Seattle now. So just a little brief overview of how we ended up doing social housing policy in Seattle. So I was a member through my work as an employee of an organization called Real Change. I was a member of a coalition called the House Our Neighbors Coalition. House Our Neighbors originally formed as an organization or as a coalition that was intended to fight against a ballot initiative that was primarily criminalizing homelessness. And we were an organization of people that believed in addressing root causes of homelessness and not the symptoms. And so we formed in opposition to a ballot initiative. And then later, once we beat that initiative, we decided to do our own pro initiative, which was the social housing I-135. So the timeline of our initiative, we started, once we beat the other initiative, we started doing research and drafting in August of 2021, and we submitted our initiative to the city clerk in March of 2022. We collected signatures over a period of 4 months. We had to collect about 29,000 signatures. We had 6 months to do so, and we were finished in 4 months. Election day was on February 14th of 2023. We were winning on the first night of results and ultimately won with a 14-point margin. And currently, now that it has passed at the beginning of this year, it's in the implementation phase. There's an active board of director, which secured operational funds for 18 months that were passed through our state and city budgets. They will be hiring their 2 initial staff members in 2024 so that they can start developing new social housing buildings. But there's a lot left to do in terms of revenue and staff, but that's where it's at. So it's different from the Hawaii and California bills, which were utilizing existing developers. The Seattle Social Housing Developer Initiative was created to create a new developer or a new entity to create social housing. So Initiative 135, the very basic rundown of what it did is that it established a new government agency called the Seattle Social Housing Developer, which is within Washington, a public development authority with the agency in the city of Seattle to build, acquire, and operate mixed income publicly owned housing developments. So a lot of what Senator Chang and Allison said prior to me is a little bit about the definition of social housing, and the ways that we incorporated those is as follows. So the mixed income component in the charter of the Seattle Social Housing Developer, we put in a very soft income cap. That meant that we had 4 income brackets that are required to be served in each development. Those income brackets are 0 to 30% of the area median income, 31 to 50%, 51 to 80%, and 81 to 120%. So there have to be units in each development that fulfill those income brackets, but higher income residents may also apply and reside in Seattle social housing developer properties. And as people increase in their incomes, if they get a better job or a better paying job, promotions, they are not kicked out for their income increasing. Publicly owned in perpetuity, so it is required by the charter as well that the Seattle Social Housing Developer maintains sole ownership of its buildings and that it owns and operates, and it is forbidden by the charter from selling off any properties to non-public interests. The permanent affordability component is achieved through the fact that rent in SSHD properties is geared to income, ensuring that no resident ever pays more than 30% of their income. So that also allows for the cross-subsidization, which I'll talk a little bit more about when I describe the Montgomery County Housing Opportunities Commission. And then finally, another key pillar of our policy was democratic leadership. So both the board and individual building governance councils are made up of primarily residents of the social housing developer, so that decision-making is done by the people who live in the housing, because residents know what they need best from their housing. A few other key policy highlights that we are really proud to have been able to do since we did it through a ballot initiative. We included that there had to be a goal of making all developments mixed use so that there can be commercial space, which helps for the cost subsidization, as Allison mentioned during her presentation. All new developments being built with union labor and establishing labor harmony agreements. We included making sure that there was a budget for board members to be paid in order to make sure that, especially because we wanted the board to be a renter majority, not creating any barriers for said residents to be able to participate. Oops. There was a link on one of those that I didn't mean to do that. Okay. A goal of low barrier application processes to make sure that people don't have to pay money in order to apply. Passive house mandates on new construction, so that's where that link is. I'll send Representative Lookner my slides so that people can watch the video about what passive house means outside of this. I'm not very good at explaining it because I'm not an architect or an environmental person, but passive house is a high standard for a green building. That is explained in the video I accidentally clicked to. There are explicit requirements that there not be discrimination based on immigration status and former incarceration. We did a lot of the policy development in coalition with community organizations that work with immigrants and formerly incarcerated people, and wanted to make sure that those were clauses that were well defined in the policy. We also included robust tenant protections with restorative justice conflict resolution and a total ban on financial eviction. And then, as I mentioned, resident governance councils for each building. So now I'll get a little bit into the financing and how we built the policy to be inspired on Montgomery County's Housing Opportunities Commission. So Montgomery County, I had the privilege of speaking and working closely with them while I was developing my thesis in graduate school. They have been the Housing Opportunities Commission, which is their public housing authority. It was just rebranded to function differently than traditional public housing authorities, was rebranded in 1984. They've been doing this mixed income, debt financed housing for several decades now. In the last few years, they passed through their county council a housing production fund, which is a revolving loan fund that allows for more of the mixed income bond financed housing to occur. They're housing approximately 70% of their units are non-income restricted, so can go to people at higher ends of the income spectrum, while 30% of their units are for households between 0 and 80% AMI. And this varies from building to building, but this is the approximate breakdown. And they have achieved revenue neutrality in their public housing by using bond financing and a mixed income cross subsidization model. They are actually operating revenue positively, but revenue neutrality was the initial goal. So a little bit of description of how their revolving loan fund works, their housing production fund, and this is the exact model that Seattle will be utilizing once it is fully up and running, once it has a staff and ability to develop. It starts with a small capital grant. So Montgomery County, the Housing Opportunities Commission's grant is very small relative to their general fund. It's only a few $100,000 that they're putting towards the development. They use that as the collateral to issue bonds, and through issuing bonds, they get public debt. They do construction and acquisition, which they also pair with construction loans, private loans to get through their construction phase. Once they are finished constructing, residents move into their buildings and start paying rents. And the rents that are paid, because they have this mixed income model, rents that are paid go towards servicing the loan and operations, and they're able to fully fulfill the loan service and operations through their resident rents, with the 70% who are paying higher income levels of rent. Over time, the loan is fully repaid, and then once that is repaid, all of the additional revenue that comes in from these resident rents returns into this original fund that is then used to issue more bonds, and hence the revolving nature of the fund. So revolving funds have been used in a bunch of different places across the US for a variety of different capital revenue based projects. But Montgomery County is the first one to do a large scale housing revolving loan fund. So that is how that works. I'm gonna stop there so that we can have sufficient time for questions. But I've also just put my contact in there. I am happy to answer further questions after this evening at camille.gix@gmail.com.
Thank you, Camille. Brilliant as always. Super excited you could join us tonight. And again, we did have the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County come and present to the Select Housing Committee back in March. And I will share that video because I think it does illustrate a lot of the points that in more detail than Camille. So I think that will be helpful for people to watch as well. So now we've got some time for questions and answers. I saw a few people drop some questions there in the chat. So if you want to raise your hand, we can promote you into the as a panelist. So we'll let people put up their hands. I do see Rep. Zager's hand. Can we promote Sam into the panelist side? Kate, is that something you can do?
Representative Zager is able to talk.
Oh, yes. Okay.
Hello.
Sam, go ahead.
Hey, Grayson. Thank you. Let me. I don't think I got my video on. Anyway, thank you for everyone for organizing and participating in this. Question about the revolving financing. Thank you, Camille Gix from Seattle. It sounds like that was started like almost 4 decades ago. So I presume it has been proven to be sustainable. Can you comment on that? In Montgomery County?
They started their model in the 80s, so they have been doing this sustainable. It's not it was much smaller scale until the revolving fund was created. So the revolving fund was created in 2018 or 2019 to be able to scale up what they've already been doing. But they have been doing the mixed income debt financed revenue neutral, revenue positive housing since the 80s. It was just at a much smaller scale up until recently. And now that they've established their revolving loan fund, they will be putting up, I think they have some units that went online this year and several hundred more that are going online next year as a result of the new revolving fund, which has greater capacity to build than what they had previously.
Sam, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any other hands? This is the time. I saw a couple of hands go up and then back down. There are a couple questions in the chat. I saw one earlier from Rep Geiger. I'm not sure if Valley, if you want to talk. I do see a hand. Oh, Valley, here, you got your hand up. You want to speak? Kate, are we able to make Valley? Oh yeah, okay, Valley, you should be able to speak now.
Thanks, Grayson, and thank you for doing this. Really fascinating. I wanted to go back to the question I asked in the chat when hold on. Representative or is Senator Chang?
Yep. Senator Chang, yep.
Sorry about that. When he talked about the multi-housing, that big development he talked about where there were single family homes in the middle of it. And he said they were, that the construction was actually paid for through the sale of the houses, but that these houses were meant for median income people. And I did the math and I just couldn't figure out how that worked. I have to assume Hawaii has an even higher cost per square foot of building than we do. Maine currently, the coastal area is $550 a square foot. So you're talking about even a small 1,000 square foot house for a family being $500,000. And Maine's median income is something like 58,000, not anywhere possible. So I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about what you mean by that I'm assuming there have to be subsidies somewhere to get that started.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in the Kauai County project. I have visited it, but they're doing a few things. So first of all, it's 120% of AMI, not 100% of AMI. Second of all, the only thing that is revenue neutral is the actual vertical construction of those single family houses themselves. So the land is free, the infrastructure is subsidized. And the single family construction tends to be cheaper than multifamily construction. So I think that's one of the issues. And also, as you might know, you can manipulate the AMI level just by having a larger income, a larger sized family. So I think that they're targeting a family of 4 at 120% of AMI. And finally, I don't know if this is true for Kauai. It's certainly true for my home county, but there's HUD has something called a high cost adjuster or something like that, which means that in areas with high median rents, where the median rents exceed 35%, I think, of the median incomes, HUD actually allows this separate formula to calculate AMI, which is not based on actual incomes, but is based on those rents. And so we've estimated using the calculations that, at least for my home county, that the AMI figures are actually about 16%. They're adjusted upwards about 16% above what the actual area median income is.
Rep Geiger, does that answer your question to an extent?
It sounds like if I'm understanding correctly, it sounds like this single family housing is for people between 120 or higher median income, which makes sense. And that it's possible to build them on free land. You still have the infrastructure costs unless those are rolled in. Is the sewer, water also part of the land, so that they are just building the building itself is the cost that you're selling the house for?
Yeah, so these are for families making up to 120% of AMI, and the sewer, water, and other infrastructure costs are being subsidized by other sources, including the county.
Great, thank you. That helps explain it.
Thanks, Rep. Geiger. There are a couple of questions in the question and answer function, and I'll just read them out here. So Peg Hoffman asks, how do you, and I assume like anybody on any of the panelists, how do we feel about pushback from private real estate developers who I assume oppose this this competition from the public sector? Actually, we haven't really seen that in Maine, thankfully, around my bill, because I think there's a lot of recognition that we're in such a huge crisis. But the history of housing in the U.S., that's certainly been a theme. And I don't know if any of our other panelists can comment on that specifically.
I can briefly talk about what we saw from a campaign side of things. We didn't have a lot of pushback from private entities. We actually had quite a lot of support, and I think that the reason that a lot of private developers supported this initiative is because they know, like, right now in Seattle, private developers rightfully are being required in a lot of places to include affordable units and that continues to increase as they buy up the market share of housing. And they aren't able to do it and still make a profit if they can't provide a lot of affordable units and make a profit, but they know that there's a need for affordable units. And so they didn't really see it as competition. They saw it as a way to more affordably and more efficiently provide the affordable units that they were unable to provide if they wanted to continue making a profit. And that's, yeah.
Thanks,
Just to
Camille.
chime in, so
go ahead, Senator Chang.
thanks, Grayson. There was while we've been working on the bill to do this 99-year leasehold revenue neutral type project, there were a lot of bells and whistles in the bill, including several that didn't make it to the final form. One of them was we had built in an equity share provision in which 75% of any profit realized upon the resale of these homes would go back to the state. And I mean, that's basically a very large capital gains tax to discourage the speculation, real estate speculation in these units. And one of the major developers here in Hawaii was really opposed to that provision because he believed that such a large equity share would discourage buyers from purchasing these units. So we did take that out, but now the bill does permit these windfall profits to the lucky early buyers and all buyers of these units. Now, that being said, in places where you can resell the social housing like Singapore, the government actually views that as a feature and not a bug, because 80% of the population of Singapore lives in these types of community units. And because they are the largest investments that most families make in Singapore, as in the United States, if there was a large long-term and significant real estate resale price downturn in Singapore, the government would view that as a big problem, just as it would in the United States, in the wake of the 2008 Great Recession, when the government really wanted to prop up residential home prices, and certainly that happened in the Great Depression as well.
Thank you, Senator Chang. I see Madam Speaker's hand, Rachel Talbot-Ross. Can we get Rachel in? Madam Speaker, I think you can unmute. Hey, well, let's hear from Madam Speaker. You want to put in the chat what you were going to ask, or I'm not sure if there's an issue happening. Can we make sure that both Speaker Talbot Ross and Rep Sargent can unmute? Oh, yep. Go ahead. Yeah, Rep Sargent, you can go ahead.
Thank you so much, Grayson, for this. I was wondering, I mean, the idea of using public land, state, county, and local, is so attractive because I know certainly here in parts of York County, the cost of land is outrageous, and would prohibit any of this activity. As you have researched how we might proceed with this in Maine, have you been able to have discussions with various people about the amount and type and location of the kind of public land that we might be able to access?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Ollie, for that. And I think one of the things that came up early in our discussions was, Allison talked about this in her presentation about what's happening in California, is this idea of like the land bank. So Rep Sachs, I believe, is also on the call. And last session, we did enact a land bank that has sort of similar goals about being able to obtain blighted land, or just land that's not able to for whatever reason. We have a lot of abandoned mills in Maine, and a lot of those sites have significant environmental remediation needs and things like that. So the land bank would be able to rehabilitate those sites and make them suitable for development. And one of the discussions that we had early on was, well, could this developer work really well in a land bank? And I think in some areas of the country, they're kind of discussing that. But here, since the land bank is in such a nascent form, we aren't really at that stage yet where that was a viable option. So I decided in my most recent iteration of the bill to pull the land bank out of it. But I think when we're looking at what state land and what local municipal land could go into a project like this, I think it would have to be, there'd have to be significant cooperation across departments. And I know, departments like the Department of Transportation have a lot of land and a lot of really great areas that is just unused, or, it's we'd have to find partners. Any community developer of this magnitude would have to find partners with the different state entities and municipalities. So does that answer your question a little bit?
Yes, thank you.
Yep, great. And I don't know if Madam Speaker can unmute, but if she'd like to, she of course is more than welcome to. In the meantime, I had some other questions in the Q&A. So Liz Trice asks, what is the minimum effort for a municipality to maintain ownership? Is property management contracted out, or does the city have to hire more employees? What else is involved? So I think it really depends on the state and the model. It could be contracted out. It could require a number of employees. Actually, in some of my conversations after my bill had a public hearing, after my bill had a public hearing, some of my colleagues on the Republican side expressed interest in this bill if we could make it so that it didn't require any more positions being created. So I think that's a discussion to have, like what other departments could take this on, and what sort of, do they want to contract out, and how much more money is that going to cost? So I think that really depends. And that's a conversation to keep having. And then Melanie Sachs, Rep Sachs, has just said if anybody wants to reach out to her, she'd be happy to talk about the Maine Redevelopment Land Bank Authority. So thank you for that, Melanie. And then Jamie Beck asks, it sounds like these community housing developments have happened primarily in urban areas. The Metro Portland area would fit this dynamic, but are there examples of successful community housing projects in more rural areas? which may lag in progressive thinking, planning, et cetera, et cetera. Does the state of Maine have a pulse on unrestricted county land parcels, which may be useful to these endeavors? Great question. And yeah, and I think there does have to be a rural component. Make sure this isn't just about urban development. So my bill is called the Community Housing and Rural Development Authority. That would be created through my bill. So when and Senator Chang did touch on this because there are some pretty remote parts of Hawaii, so they I think they're doing some of that there. I did ask that question to the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County when they came and spoke to the committee. And kind of the question or the answer was just, yeah, we can do this type of development really anywhere. Because, you know, you're just replacing high interest private loans with public low interest capital, and you can really recreate the model anywhere. And you can see significant improvements in the amount of you know, affordability that you can get to. Senator Chang, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so that project that we discussed earlier with the single family housing in the middle, that was in Kauai, on Kauai County, a very rural county. And actually, having visited that site, it's a pretty remote rural site. And as it happens, actually, two of the more rural counties of Hawaii, Maui and Kauai, actually have higher home prices than our urban county. And that's why I think Kauai felt the need to innovate in this manner. So it's certainly not restricted to urban areas. With rural areas, though, I think that there are a couple of complicating factors. One is probably the increased cost of infrastructure if you're going to run sewer all the way to a pretty remote site. And the second of which is, resistance to development. I recall, attending a meeting on Maui County where there was a lot of resistance to building new affordable housing because it would create a new stoplight on the highway that already had a lot of traffic. And so they were saying, well, why don't you concentrate the development where the transportation infrastructure and the public transportation already exists, like in an urban center? So there's no reason it couldn't be done in a rural area, but there are also some additional complications if one does do these types of projects in rural areas.
Great. Thank you for that. And I do see Madam Assistant Minority Leader Amy Arata is asking a question. I don't know if she wants to put up her hand, but want to read this in the chat. Who enforces rules related to quality of life, such as, Amy, would you like to speak?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess my question as an experienced landlord, I would like to know who enforces the rules related to quality of life issues such as noise and smoking policies and timely rent payments as well. And what are the consequences for any violations? I know it was mentioned that they don't do evictions for non-payment in some of these housing models. So I'd like to know how they enforce payment. Thank you.
Great. That's an excellent question. And thank you for being here, Madam Assistant Minority Leader. And I think I'd actually like to direct that question to Camille, because I think that was a big discussion as part of their referendum.
Yeah, so I mentioned that there would be a prohibition on financial eviction, which that was written in for both ends of the spectrum. So if someone were to lose their job, they wouldn't be evicted for their inability to pay rent. And the same thing goes for those who would get promoted, would not be evicted for making too much, which is unlike our current affordable housing models that we have. And so in a lot of places that operate social housing, they keep a fund of emergency rental payment. Seattle has emergency rental payment programs. And so I think it would be very dependent on the place, but within the city of Seattle, we have started to build up a program and a fund to allow for emergency rental payments. And in terms of noise and smoking policies, we wrote into the initiative alongside some legal experts who work in defending tenants in cases of eviction, in terms of evictions that would normally happen because of behavioral issues. We wrote in that there must be a restorative justice conflict resolution process developed by the board once they have residents to address those issues. Again, the board is brand new. They've only been in operation for a few months. So these processes have not been developed, but the board is going to be working on them once they have gotten through these first funding questions.
Thanks, Camille. And actually, I think this kind of touches on LD2 as well, which the legislature passed last session, was sponsored by Madam Speaker, which is about, housing first and housing first navigators and kind of housing support staff. So one of the discussions that we had in committee is, were these housing first developments all going to be site-based or scattered site, which essentially means, like, are you going to have sort of some navigators that are able to go out into the community and help tenants when they struggle with different things, like, if there is a nuisance and it is affecting other tenants, then one of those housing support staff could help navigate that as well. So, trying to avoid evictions at all costs. But, I think, ultimately it will have to be up to, each building, because there will be a lot of resident control. So I think that a lot of that autonomy would be up to each building. Does that answer your question, Reparata? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I guess so. It's going to be a board, I guess, of their peers that determine whether they're evicted or not. Basically, is that what you're saying?
Yes, well, it could in each building, since it will have resident control, and each building will have like a board that's in my building, which is modeled off of what Seattle did. Each building will have a board that could sort of like remediate those things, or if they, decide that they want to move forward in the worst case scenario with, like, maybe trying to find like some other housing options that are more suited to that individual in the most extreme cases. So, but I think it would have to be left up to each building.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And one more hand up, and then I think we're at time here, but I would like to hear from Aaron, if you'd like to speak.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So I guess my question is specific to developments within the city of Portland. So currently Portland has the Green New Deal referendum, which says that any development over 2,500 square feet that draws any municipal, I think it is, funding specifically, has to be at least Silver LEED certified. So I'm just sort of curious whether the funding structure proposal for these projects is drawing any municipal funding that would make any developments subject to the Green New Deal referendum qualifications.
Right. Yeah, excellent question. So I think, one of the advantages of this model of development is that, at least what we've seen in Montgomery County, is that they're able to do, these developments that are to these incredible passive house standards, because sort of, the capital is so much cheaper when it's done through a revenue bond like this. So a lot of that money can go into things like energy efficiency and insulation. And, maybe I could have Rep. Kessler, if he's still on the call. He might like to speak about that, because I know that's his wheelhouse. So I think that, this could work really well in the city of Portland, and, reaching some of those, standards that were implemented by referendum here in the city.
Well, I guess the second part of that question is then, like, one of the sort of challenges of the Green New Deal referendum is that it makes it more complicated to repurpose existing infrastructure that, you know, like older housing stock or older building stock that may be harder to sort of retrofit to meet silver LEED standards, and sort of disincentivizes the use of existing buildings. So I'm just sort of wondering if like the funding structure of your bill is counting on drawing a certain amount of proceeds from municipal funding sources that would put that Green New Deal referendum requirement on the developments. Does that make sense?
Right. That's a great question. In my bill, it doesn't ask for any, you know, funding from any municipalities, and my bill would be, you know, this program would be funded through, you know, the state general fund, or through we could find another department or state agency that this could work well in. So it's not going to ask for any city money. It's just, you know, really just create, you know, any entity that's able to bond can do this
Right.
type of housing. And so if they can raise enough capital to do those sorts of retrofits that, you know, I guess are becoming harder to do in Portland. I'm not really familiar with that dynamic. I would love to talk to you more about that. Because I think it is an important thing to discuss.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Well, I'm happy to stay on for a little bit longer, but just to respect everybody's time, I will say that this is the official end of the Community Housing for Legislators and Community Members Forum. I am super grateful to especially Senator Stanley Chang for joining us from the great state of Hawaii, and following his work closely, and Allison Lim, who is Assemblymember Alex Lee's Chief of Staff, joining us from California. Thank you, Allison, for being here. Camille Gix, as always, from the Seattle Initiative 135 referendum. Great expert to have. And a special thanks to Maine People's Alliance for hosting us. So couldn't have done it without your support. Thank you, Kate Blackford, for indulging me in organizing this forum. So, and very special thanks to everybody who joined. I am recording this. I will make sure to have copies of the slides, and excited to distribute that to everybody. So stay tuned for that. You'll be receiving more emails from me. So anyway, take care, aloha, and we'll see you next time.